have in mind is what is frequently called, and maybe you've heard this, I've mentioned it, I'm sure, is called the threefold division of the law. The threefold division of the law basically looks at the law system in the Old Testament, and it differentiates three types of law which are present in the Old Testament. One is moral law, so that is an unchangeable moral standards that are a reflection on God's character. The civil law, which has to do with those things which the government or the state should uphold for the prospering and the peace and the safety of society. And then the last is the ceremonial law, which are like those food customs and dress customs and so forth that Israel was commanded in her worship. Okay? So this threefold division of the law, again, was not controversial. This was just Christianity in a generic form. And so even the Catholics hold to this division of the law. You see this differentiation very clearly in Thomas Aquinas, who the Catholics called the Doctor Angelicus, the angelic doctor, in the 1200s. It's clearly stipulated in the 1200s. This is what we think is a biblically faithful way to understand the law, and nobody was challenging it. Okay, so understand again, this is not challenging anyone. This is just asserting what Christians have historically believed, and it's included on that basis. So why am I saying that? Well, since that time, since about the 1990s, a different approach has come along, which is called New Covenant theology, or progressive covenantalism. And the word progressive there has to do with historical progress. It's not liberal, not progressive in that sense. So these are conservative men, for the most part, who have held this position. So basically what's happened is, in the 1840s, you have the introduction of dispensationalism, which is it's a new system of thought for evangelicals, which basically separates Israel from the church. So you have quite a radical separation of Israel and the church, and then a whole new hermeneutical system develops where, well, this passage is for Israel, but this passage is for the church, and this part of Daniel chapter 9 is for Israel, but then this part of Daniel chapter 9 is for the church, and it became very, very choppy, and, well, from my standpoint, disjuncted. You introduce a lot of separation into the Bible that way. That was a new system of thought. That was a new hermeneutical system in the 1840s. It was popularized in the early 1900s. Most of the most problematic pieces of dispensationalism have disappeared. It's rare to find a true, like a 1920s hardcore dispensationalist is almost impossible to find today. From my perspective, that's just fine. But it's not like everything has come back together as some of that system has kind of been altered or moved back. So one of these steps back towards the covenant theology that's described here has been various attempts at hybrid, kind of a hybrid system of the older covenant theology and dispensationalism. How can we get these two back together again? And so some of these changes have been called New Covenant theology or progressive dispensationalism or progressive covenantalism and so forth. And so this is a step back to the older view, but it still has some very important differences. And basically what the New Covenant theology is saying is that the dispensationalists were basically correct that the Old Testament really has nothing to do with the church today. Okay? The Old Testament was for Israel. The church is not Israel. So the New Testament is for us. So basically the Old Testament is discarded. It's a helpful teaching tool. It teaches us, but it's not applicable to the church directly because it's for Israel. Okay? That was the older dispensational view. The New Covenant guys are basically saying, more or less, that's right. They would give more regard to the Old Testament's validity for the church today. But they would basically say this: all of the laws in the Old Testament are abolished. Okay? So the default setting is everything is gone unless the New Testament comes and puts it back in. Okay, so the default setting is the 10 Commandments are no longer relevant, but it just so happens that the New Testament puts some of them back in. So they're relevant not because it's in the older law code, they're relevant because the New Testament puts it back in. So this is kind of a biblicist approach to God's law, which basically says unless the New Testament specifically says it, there's nothing there. Okay? The older covenant theology, the one that's in here and the one that I would advocate for, says that's the wrong default setting. Okay? The correct default setting is God's law is God's law, and unless the New Testament abrogates it, it remains relevant. Okay? So we're working with a different default. The factory settings are different. So either nothing from the Old Testament carries over unless the New Testament specifically says it belongs, or no, this is one story of God. This is one unveiling of redemptive history. So it remains in place. It remains valid unless the New Testament abrogates it. Then, of course, it's gone, like the food laws, for example. And we'll get into that later. This is 30,000 feet. This is understanding why today some conservative evangelicals will challenge this chapter. And they will say, no, that understanding of the threefold division of the law, that's not biblical, that's not correct. The whole Old Testament is gone, and so the whole law code as a code is behind us. It's useful historically as a teaching tool, but it's not on the church today. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that well without taking too much time on that, but I think I'll stop there and ask for any kind of questions of clarification or where there's maybe a bit of fuzziness or any questions on that. Does that make sense? That historical flyover? Right. So Inga's asking about antinomianism, which is like the photonegative of legalism, right? Legalism is we're adding all kinds of man-made laws, or we're trying to be saved by the law, one or the other. Antinomianism is there is no law. I'm under grace. I can do what I want. The concern that I think those of us who have kept on with the older way of doing covenant theology, the classical way, are concerned about antinomianism. Dispensationalism was explicitly antinomian. They knew they were antinomian, and they expressed that. Okay, so that idea, and we've discussed this lots, this idea that was floating around in dispensationalism in the 1980s that said you can receive Jesus as Savior but never as Lord, and you'll go to heaven. Okay, Zane Hodges it was called No Lordship Salvation, and Zane Hodges was very clear. If we're saved by grace, that means fruit is an optional second step. Otherwise, we're not actually saved by grace. That controversy is what put John MacArthur on the map, and where he quit calling himself a dispensationalist and he started calling himself a leaky dispensationalist because he saw there's major problems in dispensationalism, and I think there are very major problems in that Darby kind of Schofield style of dispensationalism. I think there's deep problems in that system. And so John MacArthur is not an antinomian, but that is the concern that this radical breaking apart of the Old and the New Testament is a problem. I think sometimes it takes a while for us to see the fruit of where our ideas are going. I don't think they were trying to be, but their system of thought forced antinomianism into the church. I don't think they tried to do that. I'd say the 1980s were closer to Darby and Schofield. Logically, MacArthur's on his way back to covenant theology. He's not quite there. But he's moving back. Okay. But still not. John MacArthur would disagree with this chapter, would be one way to say it. John MacArthur would say that threefold division of the law is nowhere in the Bible. So he is that much of a dispensationalist, but he's not so much that he's with that no lordship 1980s, accept Jesus as Savior. If you want to later, you can accept him as Lord as well. He's not on board with that. Yeah. More questions on this? I'm doing this backing up because, like I said, until the 1940s or 1920s, let's say, any evangelical would have had no problem with this chapter. Now, even conservative men like John MacArthur would disagree with this way of formulating our understanding. But it is working. I do believe that the trajectory is coming back together. Are we ready to dive in? Well, not quite. I'm going to say one more thing here. I don't want to rush this because this is quite significant and very practical, okay? Because you're going to have good friends like R.C. Sproul and John MacArthur. R.C.'s dead. John MacArthur's in his final lap, according to his own testimony. Wonderful friends together on the gospel would disagree on this chapter, okay? R.C. Sproul holding the classical view, MacArthur holding more of a dispensational or kind of New Covenant style of view. So this is practical. You'll see both of these out there today, okay? And in our smaller, kind of, let's say, Reformed Baptist orbit, the guys that would hold the view that I would hold here would be guys like Bodie Balcom, Paul Washer, Jeff Durbin, the G3 guys. They would hold this classical view. And then more in the kind of MacArthur world, you would see a different approach to this here. Following which? What's laid out here? A ditch that you could hit if you go too far the other way? Okay, well, I think a ditch that you could hit in the other way is if you would fail to distinguish. So if we're going to say, yes, the Old Testament law is valid, at least the moral component of the Old Testament law is valid. If you fail to distinguish the difference between ceremonial laws and some of that versus the moral laws, you could fall into legalism. And I think that is what the New Covenant guys were concerned about. Okay? I think the problem is fixed by thinking carefully and making proper distinctions rather than abolishing a whole way of thought. But that would be the concern, is that if we fail to distinguish some of these things, you're going to get people who start adding laws. Like we're still living in Old Testament Israel, which we're clearly not. Okay, I don't want to rush this. These are good questions so far. So again, 30,000 foot view before we get in here. So what is the threefold understanding that was present at this time? It basically would work like this. These three categories of law, moral, civil, and ceremonial, are trying to resolve this problem that Jesus did not come to abolish the law, but to, and yet the very same New Testament says we're not under law, but under, okay, so what is it, Jesus? Would you please make up your mind, Jesus? Are we no longer under the law, or did you come to fulfill the law and not abolish it? Not one jot or tittle will. And Paul, or Peter, in his white sheet vision, eat whatever you want. Eat pigs. Eat shrimp. But, whoa, but what, not one jot? Right. Okay, so do you see the problem here? Do you see the dilemma? Can you see that the Bible itself is going to force us to think carefully? Okay? This is not as simple as Old Testament irrelevant, New Testament relevant. There's something deeper happening here. That's actually one of my concerns, is that the New Covenant or progressive covenantal approach is too simplistic. It just Old Testament irrelevant, New Testament good. But there's more happening there than that. So how would we resolve this, that not one jot or tittle of the law could ever pass away? Jesus did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, and yet clearly all the food laws are gone and irrelevant for us today as Christians. Okay. Can we at least grant we have to do something with that? Okay? So classically, here's how it's understood. I think one of the problems is that covenant theology has not been clear always. So when you make this threefold distinction, here's what I think some people think. Here's a 5-gallon pail called moral law. Here's a 5-gallon pail called civil law. And here's a 5-gallon pail called ceremonial law. And we're going to look at every verse in the Bible that tells us to do something, and we're going to examine it and say, yeah, that looks like ceremonial law, so we're going to go drop it in this bucket. And then we'll look at, that looks moral, so we'll drop it in this bucket. That becomes very arbitrary, right? I think we could all see how arbitrary that could become. If these are 3 buckets that we're just categorizing and dropping things into. A better way to look at it, I think a faithfully biblical way, and the historical way to look at it is, don't look at this like 3 kind of horizontal buckets that you just drop things into. Rather, let's look at this like a house that has a foundation which cannot be moved, and then walls, and then you can put decoration up on your walls, like paintings and that kind of thing. Okay? God's moral law is the foundation, immovable, cannot possibly be altered ever under any conditions anywhere in the cosmos. It's there. And it's not up for negotiation. Then you can put studs on there and you can build walls, okay, that make things orderly in the house and differentiate things like civil laws. But if the grandkids buy the farmhouse and the granddaughter wants a bigger kitchen than grandma had, and that's how things work differently because we're not living in grandma's world anymore, can you move a wall without destroying the house? Yeah, you can. Okay? Are you allowed to take mom's artwork off the wall and put up your own artwork? Well, now for sure. Okay? So rather than look at 3 separate, well, maybe Lori wasn't allowed to, I don't know. I know some farm women who have had a very hard time doing anything differently in the house because grandma had it that way. And we have to freeze 1938 in time. That much is clear. Okay? So I think rather than looking at 3 buckets where we just arbitrarily look at things, I think let's look at the way the law itself unrolls in the Old Testament. God's moral foundation cannot change. So here's what I mean. Is adultery wrong today? Was adultery wrong in Moses' Israel? Was adultery wrong 100 years before Moses showed up on the scene? Okay. Is eating shrimp wrong today? No. Was eating shrimp wrong in Moses' Israel? Yes. Was eating shrimp wrong 100 years before Moses? No. Okay. Weird. What's going on? Okay, what's going on? Could God's moral law ever be different than it is? Could God himself say that now adultery is good? Adultery is permissible. Could God do that? Could God do that? No. No. There's many things God cannot do, and that is wonderful. God cannot sin. God cannot be any different than he is. The moral law predates Moses because it's a reflection of God's character. Adultery was wrong 1,000 years before Moses showed up. Adultery was wrong before there were humans on the planet because God is faithful. Okay? Murder and telling lies were wrong before Moses ever showed up. We don't actually need stone tablets from Sinai for lying to be wrong. That's not the basis of why lying is wrong. God's character is the basis of why lying is wrong. It's baked into creation. Moses writes it down to clarify it. But the moral law predates Moses. It's always there, and it is immovable and unshakable and inalterable. Okay? Moses comes down from the mountain with a code that shows us about it, but the contents of that code cannot be shaken because they're part of God's character. And I'll add one more just for the sake of clarity here. It so happens that the New Covenant men say, well, yeah, but 9 of the 10 commandments did, in fact, come back in the New Covenant. So what are we arguing about? Well, something. Does a 1 in 6 pattern remain today? Is that a moral law or a ceremonial one? Sabbath. Is there a 1 in 6 pattern of work and rest before Moses? Yes, there is. Okay? The New Covenant men will say there is no Sabbath today. That's antiquated, and that's really practically the biggest one. No, do whatever you want. Okay? That's where this really comes down to a very practical difference. Tim, you had your hand up. It's there. The Sabbath is also predates Moses. It's there right from creation on. There's a 6-in-1 pattern well before Moses. Okay, but that was on Saturday. That was on the 7th day. Now we have it on the first day. Okay? Well, can God change the day once he starts a new creation in Christ based on his resurrection? Yes. So has the day changed in keeping with Christ creating, making all things new? Yes. I do believe so. And it's not such a stretch to put it at the beginning of the week because Adam was created on day 6. And what was the Sabbath? Day? So for Adam, Sabbath is on day number 1. The Sabbath is Adam's day 1. It's not such a stretch to say we start the week with the Sabbath. There's a hint of that there already. Caitlin and then Jeremy. Okay, that's fine. Okay. A polygamist? Okay. Okay, so Caitlin's wondering about Keenan's other wives. We will get to that. Yeah. You don't know about them, do you? No? Some of us remember. Yep. Yes, the New Testament says nothing about bestiality or incest. Nothing. Not a word. Yep. That's right. So when the New Testament says, so Jeremy's saying correctly, if we're going to say nothing carries over, the New Testament is utterly silent on bestiality and incest. Talks about sexual immorality, but okay, how are we going to fill that category in? Do we just get to decide what sexual immorality is? Or do we already have a concept? If you're an early Christian with the Old Testament, do you already know that it's a shame for you to cover your father's nakedness? And your father's brother's nakedness, which means his wife. Right? This category is already filled in for us if we understand the abiding validity of this one history of redemption that's come through. On polygamy, that is a rabbit trail, maybe a helpful one. Is it certainly present in the Old Testament? Yes, clearly. It's all over the place. Okay? Is that something ordained or approved of by God? Right? So we're talking about pre-Moses. Can we derive moral principles from the way God created the world even before Moses that are consistent with the Ten Commandments? I'd say yes. Because what does Moses' law presuppose? Don't commit adultery must mean there's something unlawful about a sexual relationship with someone who's not my wife. Right? Now we could also get into, is polygamy as egregious as sodomy? And I think probably not. Okay? I think unaided by biblical reason, I think it's more understandable that pagan cultures would practice polygamy than that they would practice sodomy. Because there's nothing in nature itself, unaided without God's help, that would say polygamy is wrong. Because I go in nature and I see my bull does that, and right, well, Don's bull, actually. Okay? He's a polygamist, and that happens in November when you're hunting deer, you see there's lots of females per male, right? So in nature, is it understandable that unaided by God's law, that gets there? Yeah, but God's law nowhere permits it, and in fact, I'd say by the fact that God creates one man and one woman from the beginning shows us how this ought to work, It's one man and one woman right from the beginning. Okay? And do we need a law? Does the New Testament even prohibit polygamy? Well, if we're going to be real biblicists and say, unless I have chapter and verse, there's nothing that carries over. All the New Testament does is say you can't be a church elder if you're a polygamist. That's it. I'm not a biblicist. I am sola scriptura to the teeth. I am a rock-ribbed biblical absolutist. I am not a biblicist. I think that limits the Bible far too much to say I need a specific chapter and verse or else I'm free to do it. The Bible knows nothing of internet pornography. The Bible doesn't talk about child pornography. The Bible doesn't talk about heroin. The Bible doesn't talk about weed. The Bible doesn't talk about a whole bunch of things which are clearly moral categories if we're understanding there's an abiding moral foundation that's built in God's character itself. Sean. Before Moses showed up. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think any Israelite should have been surprised at what was on those tablets. If you're observing creation, you know everything on those tablets. Because the law is built, it's in God's character. Which means it cannot possibly be anything other than what it is. Okay? These are not positive laws. Okay? And by positive law, I mean like God specifically says something, and then because he says it, that's what makes it right or wrong. Okay? I'm going to try to phrase this properly. Moral law is what it is because of God's character. It's wrong because it violates God's character. Whereas positive laws or ceremonial laws are simply wrong because God says it. Okay? So again, is murder wrong? Like wrong? Okay? Like 1,000 years before Moses wrong? And into eternity wrong? Yes, because that's a moral principle. It's built in the character of God. Okay? Because God creates life and he breathes life. So it's a violation of God's character. Now, this isn't a trick. Let's go back to shrimp. Okay? Could an ancient pre-Moses have eaten shrimp with a clean conscience? Can someone in the future eat shrimp with a clear conscience? Could an Israelite during Moses, after Moses, between Moses and Christ, was it okay for them to eat shrimp? No. But you see, the basis of what makes it wrong is different. It's not an eternal principle. It's God says this is how we're doing things right now. Okay? You see the basis of it. God said it, therefore it's wrong. Whereas moral law, God is something, therefore it cannot possibly be any different than what it is. It's impossible for God to change the moral law because it's impossible for God to quit being God. Okay? So the basis is quite different. Here's another illustration that can maybe help us to understand the difference here. If you are a soldier in the army, what kind of work did you sign up to do? This isn't a trick. What's that? Murder? Killing the bad guys? Okay. So Howard, you're enlisting and I'm your commanding officer, and I'm going to teach you how to use a gun, and I'm going to teach you how to hide yourself. Okay, right? And I'm going to teach all this stuff. And if you do it wrong, I'm going to get this close in your face, and I'm going to yell at you all kinds of rude things about your family and whatever else, right? And you're going to learn. But here's the deal. I'm going to do the same thing if you didn't polish your shoes. And I'm going to do the same thing if you didn't iron your pants just right. Okay. Do shiny shoes and pressed pants make any difference when Howard's in the jungle in Vietnam? None whatsoever. Once we're fighting, it doesn't matter how your pants and your shoes look. So why did I make such a big deal of it in drill camp? Why was it such a big deal in boot camp, and now that we're fighting, it doesn't matter? Follow orders. You will learn to take orders and you will not question me because I'm getting radioed instructions and they know far more about what's around us than we do. Okay? The reason you shine your shoes and you press your pants is because you learn to not question. You just obey. Okay? That's what the ceremonial law is. Israel, you need to learn. You just obey. God knows more than you do. Yes, one day we can eat shrimp and we can eat bacon. And yes, one day you can grow your beards however you want, and you can shave if you want, and you can grow a beard if you want. Now, I don't care. But right now, you need to learn obedience, and you will not question it. You just obey. Okay? Ceremonial law. The basis of it is of a different nature. Okay? The gun skills that Howard learns are abiding. They serve the ultimate goal. The boot camp instructions are temporary. They're teaching principles so that we understand the bigger goal. Lisa and then Jeremy. Okay, well, thou shalt not kill. Okay, so Lisa's asking, we're getting a little bit into the weeds here, but that's my own fault because I used a military analogy. So I think what your question is, how do we square thou shalt not kill with that we're just talking about? Yeah, except the word there is ratza, which has to do with murdering. So there too we have to make a little bit of distinction, because right after Moses comes down with the tablets and it says thou shalt not murder, then there's a party going on with the golden calf, and Moses isn't too happy about it, so he says grind it up, put it in the water, and then here's instructions from God. Levites, pull out your swords and start killing everyone you can find, and you will keep killing until I say stop. Whoa, 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 what's going on there? Moses just came down with stone tablets that said do not murder, and now God directly is commanding Levites, kill everything you see until I say it's time to stop. There's a difference between killing and murder. Killing is frequently justified. If it's based on guilt and if it's done by a proper authority, killing is frequently just. Capital punishment is just. Israel's wars, as long as they followed God's instructions, are just. Okay? So pacifists take an absolutist approach. Do not murder means any killing is wrong. Okay? So capital punishment is out if you're a pacifist. All wars are unjust wars if you're a pacifist. I'm not a pacifist. And I don't think you can make that work, because why would the same God who just said thou shalt not murder now tell the Levites start killing? And I'll say when we're done. But you're actually in sin if you don't draw your sword and start killing. So I do think there is a biblical distinction between murder and killing. Otherwise, the state would never be given the sword for anything. The difference is murder, a nice way to summarize it, murder is an unjust taking of a human life. The key being unjust, and it's by an improper authority. So if somebody would murder someone in my family, they deserve to die. And I would say, biblically, that's actually the only just punishment if it's first-degree murder. The only biblical punishment for murder is taking someone's life, and you can actually find that in Genesis 9 under Noah. Okay, the image of God is so precious that if somebody intentionally, unjustly takes that, the only way to deal with them is to take their life. That's the only way to show God's justice in this situation. Okay, and now I'm playing my hand. I am not a pacifist. Okay, but that's different than the murder. Okay, so there's no contradiction between me saying I am anti-abortion and I am pro-capital punishment. That's not actually, there isn't a contradiction there, I don't think. But go ahead, Jeremy. That's right. Yeah, so Jeremy's saying some of these laws are so clear that God destroys non-Israelite nations because they violated, it says, his covenant. But that's interesting because God didn't enter into a redemptive covenant with Philistia or with Nineveh like he did with Israel. But they're still under Adam, they're still under Noah. They know what's right and wrong, and if they're engaging in sodomy and if they're engaging in child sacrifice, they have enough of God's law to know you deserve to die for these things. In fact, I will see to it that you get wiped out because you are practicing abominable things that even just the delight of nature is enough of God for you to know that what you're doing is wicked. So this shows inalterable moral principles in the universe because it's God's universe. Okay, so natural law should not be understood to be it operates independently of God. Like God showed up to our universe and then he found this big cardboard box that said law. And then he looked in there and said, oh, yeah. Oh, it says here, do not murder. Okay, I guess I'll be the kind of God who prohibits murder. No. God did not find pre-existing laws in nature. Natural law is what it is because this is God's universe. And so it necessarily reflects his character. And so then what we should do is understand the specific laws, the positive laws, the civil laws, and the ceremonial laws as being like case laws that help make application of God's moral law in specific situations. Straightforward example. If you live in Moses' Israel, do you have to build a parapet around your roof so grandma doesn't fall off when you're drinking iced tea in the evening? Yeah. What's the moral principle underneath that? What's the moral principle? Safety, because we want to preserve life, right? It's rooted in the 6th commandment. Preserve life. Okay? Is it still abiding that we need to preserve life and respect the dignity of other image bearers of God? Has that changed? Are any of us in violation of God's law because I don't think any of us actually has a fence on our roof? See the difference? But I hope you put salt down on your sidewalk when grandma comes for a visit. Okay? There's an abiding moral law which application can in fact look different. Okay? We're not jackhammering out the concrete floor, but if you want to move that wall 6 feet over, you can. Okay? So this isn't as simple as, okay, well then it's such a package deal that we can just take Israel's laws and plop them here with a different climate and different people and different technology and so forth. No, that's not what's meant. We need to see the moral principle underneath Israel's laws. They're positive laws or case laws that judges work out, and judges continue to do that today. Who's ever heard of legal precedent? Okay? A judge makes a certain ruling in a particular case that kind of unofficially becomes law because he's trying to preserve a particular law that's actually on the books. Okay? Israel's laws are precedent. They're legal precedent. They're specific examples that help us to see how you make application of the moral law, how to preserve life, okay? How to build families, how to live in an orderly way, okay? So that the foundation is unchanging. The civil laws can be altered, but the paintings on the wall, the ceremonial laws, here's how you do a sacrifice, here's how you trim your beard, here's how you cut your hair, here's how you dress if you're a priest, here's how you eat. That's clearly typological. That's symbolic. It's decoration to show us, to point us to Christ. And you are absolutely free to take all of Grandma's old artwork down and see Grandma was pointing to something. Grandma was pointing to beauty, but this is window dressing, so to speak. This is not an eternal principle. And so Jesus says to Peter, eat what you want. Okay? Eat what you want. So this is like different depth or different thickness of God's law. This isn't arbitrarily 3 buckets beside each other and you just plunk what you want in each one. This is foundation, immovable principles, a particular application for a particular nation, for a particular season in time, and then ceremonies and symbols which help to illustrate those things. Okay? The ceremonial law is clearly gone. The civil law is adjusted all through history. The moral law cannot ever be altered. Impossible. Okay? So that is a long-form way of me saying I do believe the 10 Commandments are moral law. They're inviolable. And even the one that's the most contested, which has to do with the 1 in 6 pattern of work and rest and Sabbath and so forth. Remember when Jesus says that sometimes the sons of the world are more shrewd than the sons of light? Non-Christians understand 6 and 1 a lot better than Christians do, which is why it's frequently been attacked. I'm old enough to remember, and I'm not that old, Sunday shopping laws. Sunday was quiet even in Winnipeg when I was a kid. Our modern approach to Sunday is absolutely novel. It really is. Christians in history have never thought that you schedule hockey games Sunday morning or that you do a Costco run on Sunday. It's just never been there. It's novel, like 40 years old novel. It's truly novel. And in the French Revolution, in the late 1700s, they realized as long as we have a 7-day week, everyone's going to remember the God of the Bible. And we are rational Frenchmen. We have to kill the God of the Bible. One way they did it, we work with a base 10 number system. Wouldn't everything in metric, it's all 10s, wouldn't a 10-day week work much better than a 7-day week? 10's a nice clean number. So for 14 years in France, they had a 10-day week. And the pattern was 8 and 2. And it didn't work. People's bodies quit working. It doesn't work. Nature screams against that. 7 is built all over creation. The moon cycles. The moon regenerates on 28 days. 7s. A woman has 28 days between regenerating, her body regenerating. And right in the middle of that, day 14, is when she's fertile. The world works in 7s. You cannot escape it. Okay? God patterns time in 7s. It's in nature. Just watch the stars and you'll arrive at a 6 and 1, 7 pattern. You can do it by watching the moon. And then when God comes from Sinai and says specifically, here's how we do it. And then you see the early church, yes, they're doing it on the first day now instead of on the 7th. But clearly on the Lord's day, because of the resurrection, because creation is being rebooted, we live in creation 2.0 after Jesus. Okay, the new gardener came out. He's starting a new garden. That means God is rebooting creation, still according to the 7-day pattern. But the early Christians meet on day 1. They meet for the Lord's teaching and for the breaking of bread and for the instructions. Okay, it's on a new day, but the 6 and 1 pattern hasn't gone anywhere. We're still working with the 7-day week. Jesse. Okay, so Jesse's asking about the Seventh-day Adventists. So they're still on a Saturday Sabbath. They would say that even though the pattern in the New Testament is that the church is meeting now on the first day instead of on the 7th day, they would say, again, because there's a certain biblicism, you can observe the pattern in the Bible, but is there a verse in the New Testament that says God moved the Sabbath from day 7 to day 1? No, there's not a verse that says that. There's the worshiping pattern of God's people that demonstrate that. So they would still say it's got to stay on the same day. It's got to stay on day 7. And we would say, no, the pattern already in the New Testament is first day. And then you go back and do your work and you see, well, that makes sense. Since Jesus is the gardener in a new creation, he's the second Adam. The first Adam actually had a first day Sabbath relative to himself. So this is already prophesied in the garden that it's going to be this way. So there's nothing radical here. Okay? That would be the shorthand version of that. Yeah. You peeked at my sermon notes. Yeah. There was actually different customs then already. The general pattern being sundown to sundown. We do it midnight to midnight. Some ancients did it sunrise to sunrise. Like exactly when we start counting a new day? Yeah, sunset to sunset. Yeah, the day starts at sunset. One day ends and the new day starts at sunset. Yeah, so Friday evening becomes Saturday morning, which is the Sabbath. Yeah. Probably, well, yeah, and we're working a little bit in the dark. When did exactly? Probably they would have kept the same custom of sundown to sundown. And I would say there's actually a good principle there for us too. Not because we're going to be successful at changing our clocks, but this. Our intentionality for worshiping here on Sunday morning starts with the decisions you make on Saturday night. Okay? If Saturday night means, oh, I get to stay up till 2 a.m. watching brain rot on YouTube, or worse, and you come here and you can't keep your eyes open and you can't sing and you're not paying attention when one of the guys is praying, that's a problem. I think there's an abiding principle there. Come sunset, start thinking, how am I preparing myself to worship in the morning? I don't think that's gone. I think we're going to be unsuccessful at changing a midnight counting of days. I think we'd also be unsuccessful. We'd actually have a perfect calendar if we worked everything in sevens. We'd have a 13-month calendar with 28 days each. It would actually work perfectly. But that might take a few hundred more years before we get back to that. And it was that way at one point in time, because actually, if you notice, our months aren't actually called right. October is month 10. Should be month 8. September is month 9. It should actually be 7. There was some screwing around with the calendar by the Romans, but in a perfect world, it'd be sunset to sunset, and we would have a 13-month year with 28 days apiece, and 7 would make sense to all of us. But that had everything to do with this chapter, and yet surprisingly nothing to do with it. So that's the backdrop. Because this is so contentious today, and this is challenged, including among conservative Christians, I wanted to take a step back and understand the issues in play. We can pick that up next time. Let's close in prayer and then enjoy some coffee. Father God, thank you for your kindness to us. Thank you that you've given us your word. Thank you also for the less authoritative voice that you speak in through the history of your saints. And I pray that as we look at a challenging chapter, one that is contested even today, Lord, I pray that you would give us the humility to see our own place in history, our own place in time, that we would think through these consequences where you are calling us to search things out and to make careful distinctions. Lord, I pray that we would do that faithfully as well, and that we would not fall into one ditch or another, but that we would think judiciously with the help of your Spirit. Please illumine your word to us as we continue the study in the days and weeks ahead. Thank you for your kindness, and we pray that you prepare our hearts for worship right now. Pray this in the strong name of Jesus. Amen.